Did you know Islam has been in America since the navigators of Columbus's ships? And some argue even earlier. But its institutional presence has surged in the last 15 years, with the number of Islamic centers and seminary initiatives more than doubling since 9/11 to over 2,500 Islamic centers in more than a dozen seminaries around the country today. These centers were previously led by community volunteers who performed the various administrative and pastoral duties that are today increasingly fulfilled by full-time, paid imams. Some centers have grown to have several imams on staff. Others continue to have none. In response, I argue, Islamic seminaries are sprouting across the country to meet this perceived demand, but more importantly, to establish a local Muslim authority. Except this establishment, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. The Sunni Muslim immigrant community that I work with comprises almost half of American Muslims, and it's not a centralized community. There's no recognized body to authorize who can and cannot be an imam. Unlike priests, for example, imams don't profess allegiance or give vows to a church. When we think of other places where there are imams, you wonder where they are authorized. In Muslim majority nations, for example, that role often falls under the auspices of the state. Many European nations are moving in this direction as well. However, our conception of church-state separation in the US ostensibly precludes the government from stepping in and taking such a role. Who or what then authorizes an imam, or a seminary for that matter, is what my project is all about. As an anthropologist, I spent 3 years in the field researching Islamic seminaries and interviewing and following imams. Anthropologists conduct intense field work, spending time with a range of interlocutors. So while my primary interest is American imams, I spent time with others who inform their role, both within and outside the Muslim community. My field sites included seminaries, mosques, accreditation associations, online conversations, interviews and focus groups, events and programs, and more. Accordingly, my dissertation is an ethnography of imams, a group of people, mostly men, highly stigmatized, extremely politicized, serving in a profession that's not regulated or even yet defined. So then, where do imams come from? I've identified 3 paths. Historically and primarily, imams immigrated from overseas on visas special for religious workers that require them to provide their credentials and their certificates of study that are verified by our US Citizenship and Immigration Services before they receive a stamp of approval that permits them entry to the US to work as an imam. The second, and far lesser in number, are those from here who travel abroad to study, their destinations heavily influenced by our national security initiatives, only to return here to be hired by mosque boards who've expanded the role to be one more commonly found among American religious leadership, shifting the duties from primarily leading ritual prayer to now including responsibilities such as counseling, nonprofit administration, public relations, law enforcement expectations, community organizing, and more. Some journalists have described this as a search for Superman. I call it a search for super imam. How to train a next generation of super imams with an achievable curriculum is the biggest challenge facing Islamic seminaries today. The third path, and most recent, are those here, studying at these emerging institutions. Except these institutions aren't yet really recognizable, and they're still in formation. Perhaps these seminaries will reproduce a Muslim version of the church, authorizing who can and cannot be an imam. The institutions are pursuing their authorization from our higher education boards and accreditation associations. I trace these three paths to show how the government can both manifestly and latently inform who can and can't be an imam in the US through the bureaucratic edifice of visa approvals, through our national security laws, and through the government bureaucracy of higher education boards and of accreditation recognition. Islamic seminaries illustrate to us how a faith group tries to retain an autonomous identity while still necessarily negotiating these government bureaucracies in pursuit of its authority, showing us that our conception of the separation of the church and the state shows that they're not as separate as we all want to believe. Ultimately, this leaves imams feeling unanchored, conflicted, and vulnerable. Time will tell if the seminaries will rise to fill this authoritative void, or if the imam may somehow otherwise feel occupationally secure without a profession. Thank you.